Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and I'm joined this evening by Helena, aka No Justice MTG. Helena, thank you for joining me on a Friday evening. I think this feels somewhat unusual.
Absolutely. I was saying before we went live, see if I can do an Aaron Bastani impression. Unfortunately, I'm not much of an impressionist, so I'll leave that be for the moment. I think
he's difficult to it's difficult to do an Aaron Bastani. He's one of a kind, but of course you are also one of a kind. I'm very much looking forward to the next hour. We've got some interesting stories for you this evening. Tokyo is set to adopt a 4-day week. See if you can guess why before we get onto that story. A potential existential threat for you. Lab-made bacteria, which is mirrored, which is scary. Some scientists think it poses an unprecedented risk to society. I speak to a science journalist who can make it make sense for us all, and we'll discuss whether the era of liberal interventionism is over. Stay tuned for all of that. First, though, this show, you'll know if you've been watching this week, we are really pushing for you to become subscribers to Novara Media, supporters, I should say, on our website. We really want to prepare to have a big new year. Just before we went live, me and Gary were making plans for our new set and what that could mean for the structure of the show. Lots and lots of plans to improve your viewing experience, getting more voices on the show, covering more stories. That will require, though, a bit more money in the bank. So if you do enjoy the show, please do go to novaramedia.com/support and donate whatever you can. Our classic ask is for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month, but whatever you feel you can afford, it is massively appreciated. And if you have already become a supporter to Novara Media, thank you so much. Everything you're about to hear over the next hour is because of you. The Labour Party were elected on a pledge to completely decarbonise the British electricity system by 2030. They recently softened that target, and they now aim to just decarbonise 95% of our energy supply instead of 100%. But that's still, reasonably ambitious. And today, Energy Secretary Ed Miliband was out on the airwaves trying to explain how the government would achieve it.
We are going to need to change things. We do need big, bold reform to make this happen. Big reform of our planning system. Big reform of the way that we give projects a priority in what's called the grid queue, so connecting to the national grid. That's all part of our plan. We do need to build the grid. Local people get to have a say in this, but we are going to need this infrastructure. And if we don't build this infrastructure, the consequences are, as I've said. We do want to see, though, and this is an important question you ask, direct benefit for local communities, and we're looking at different options here. Could be could be bill discounts, community funds. So we're absolutely open to that as part of our plans, and we're going to be saying more about it in the coming weeks. But so absolutely, local communities that host clean energy infrastructure should benefit from it.
It's worth noting here the UK's energy system is already much greener than it was in the recent past. In 2010, half our electricity came from gas and another quarter from coal, obviously the dirtiest fuel. Back then, less than 3% came from wind and solar power combined. But this is what our energy mix looked like in 2023. So coal is down to 1%, which will presumably be down to 0 next year as we closed our last coal mine this year. Gas still makes up 32%. That's, of course, a fossil fuel. But wind is up to 29%. And the majority of our energy is now carbon-free. That's with nuclear, solar, etc., etc. That looks, to me, like decent progress. But some have concerns about the impact of increasing renewables as part of the energy mix, especially on days when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. And many pointed out today was in fact one of those days. So according to the National Grid, only 8% of Britain's electricity today came from renewable sources, and 69% came from gas. Now that fact led Nick Robinson to ask this question.
What happens if, like now, the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine? Is there a possibility of blackouts in that scenario?
No. That's why you have a strategic reserve of gas-fired power stations why you have, for example, long duration energy storage, why you have batteries, why you have nuclear. You have a range of things on the system to absolutely ensure security of supply. And it's a largely renewables-based system, but it's not an only renewables-based system. And indeed, only this week, there are low carbon versions of this. We signed off on a gas-fired power station in Teesside Net Zero, Teesside creating thousands of jobs, gas with carbon capture and storage.
That was Ed Miliband there saying that on days like today, when the wind isn't really blowing, the sun isn't shining, we could rely on energy stored via batteries, nuclear power and gas power with carbon capture and storage. Ariba Hamid is co-director of Greenpeace UK, and I spoke to her earlier today to find out what she made of Ed Miliband's announcements.
The top line is that the wind is blowing finally in the right direction. This is an ambitious plan. This is a plan that will make a difference in both the energy mix, but also, hopefully in the long run, bringing down people's bills and people's quality of life. So we are supportive of this ambition. This is what we need. And we're happy to hear this ambition.
Can you talk me through some of what you think of as the most significant parts of this plan? Because obviously the target was already there. And what Ed Miliband was doing today was sort of releasing this document, I suppose, to flesh out the plans. I understand sort of planning reform is part of it, saying onshore wind is going to be critical infrastructure so that they can overrule local objections. Is that sort of the main parts? Is this mainly sort of a document about planning?
It is a document about planning, and you're right. I mean, this is something that the Labour Party had signposted in their manifesto. So in terms of detail, we're still looking where this infrastructure will be built, how much are we going to actually look at tripling and trebling some of this capacity, the fact how many jobs might be created locally, how are we going to make sure that the grid is getting upgraded very, very quickly. The battery question is very important as well, so that we can store the battery when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing. So all these details are still awaited, but I think it's important to acknowledge that this has been reiterated at the national level. The fact that Ed Miliband has actually run with the promise he ran on, and the fact that he's recommitted to is, I suppose, is the significance of releasing this document this time.
You mentioned that what happens when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining. Ed Miliband was asked about that a number of times this morning, principally because today is one of those days. 69% of our electricity today came from gas. He said that on days like that, energy will come from a variety of nuclear, battery stored power that we might have got from renewable sources in the previous days. And he also said it could come from reserve backup gas power stations, which you could fire up as and when you needed them, maybe with carbon capture and storage attached. Now, when I was listening to that, I was thinking of, we've spoken before about carbon capture and storage. I know you're not particularly in favour of it. I know sort of Greenpeace's historical position has been opposition to nuclear power. So is this a place where you disagree with the government?
The bulk of this plan is about building renewable infrastructure, building it really, really fast, upgrading the grid so that there is power passing through the right channels into people's homes, and upgrading the battery, because we need to be able to store the power that we produce, which is extra, so that it can be used on the days where wind is not blowing and the sun is not shining. Now, that is the bulk of this program, which is great, which we're on board with. And I think the faster we make these changes happen, the better we'll be able to deal with days where there is more unpredictability in the energy system. On nukes and carbon capture, I think there is that argument is up for conversation. For me, nuclear may be a part of the final energy mix. I think that when we start the conversation with carbon and nuclear, we sort of lose the bigger picture. The bigger picture here is about renewable energy and the fact that this country shut down its last coal power plant after 140 years of running on coal. So this is the next big leap. It is possible. And that's the conversation here. I think the nuclear and carbon capture is a bit of a red herring. We know that carbon capture project nowhere in the world has still delivered carbon capture successfully. So for me, the proof is in the pudding. When it works, we'll talk about it. Right now, it's an experiment.
And obviously there's lots of debates as well about who will pay for this. I think my understanding is the government is hoping that sort of the filling out of the energy infrastructure we need, sort of both in terms of power cables and new solar power plants and wind farms, is going to come from private money. Is that something that sounds, I suppose, both reasonable and plausible to you?
Private players are going to be important for the success of this plan. In fact, they should look at hard look at their portfolios. Some of the banks that we've been campaigning against in the past, for example, the climate movement, the Barclays, the HSBCs of the world, they are still spending a disproportionate amount of money on new fossil fuel infrastructure. And this should serve as a signal to them to actually divert that money into new renewable infrastructure, because this is where the energy system in this country is going.
When we talk about climate change, it's normally quite miserable. I have to say, your answers or your tone sounds almost quite cheerful at the moment. When I was looking at sort of the recent history of our energy mix to sort of prepare this segment, I was thinking this looks like a good news story. Is that how people should be thinking about sort of energy in Britain? Sort of, it's not necessarily the case that our government hasn't cared anything about climate and that nothing's changed. We're still going to hell in a handbasket. Can we actually sort of say this is quite decent progress that we've made over the past 15 years?
It is decent progress. I think the climate movement is guilty of not celebrating their wins when they come along, and there aren't very many. They are slow to come. But I think it's worth noting that change happens very slowly. When I started working on climate nearly 20 years ago, I cut my teeth on ending coal, both in India and in this country. And then it happens all of a sudden and all at once. And now we're seeing the ending of coal. I mean, this year, China, for the first time, stopped building new coal power plants in the last quarter of last year. So yes, things are changing. And sometimes we need to take a step back and say, you know what, this is decent progress and we should acknowledge that. So yeah, that's where we are at today.
I don't think I've asked you about this before, but you mentioned there sort of you were campaigning on the electricity system in India and coal there. How does what's going on in India compare to what's going on here when it comes to our electricity systems? Because, the climate doesn't care where the carbon is being emitted. Obviously, India is now the most populous country in the world. So their energy policy probably matters a bit more than ours. Could you give us a bit of an update on what's going on over there?
So India is where perhaps the UK was a decade ago, in that it's hedging its bets. So it's building solar energy. And India is one of those countries where the sun shines pretty much throughout the year. Lots and lots of potential to really power the entire country over solar energy. But it's hedging its bets. It's still thinking of building coal power plants, but it's also building lots of solar power plants. Essentially, I think what it needs is global leadership. And this is where the UK comes back into the picture, and other G7 countries to come to the table and really offer both funding and technological know-how so that countries like India can leapfrog. They don't have to go through the same trajectory that the UK went through. They can actually leapfrog some of that fossil fuel expansion and rely entirely on solar energy. It's entirely possible, and I feel optimistic about that.
I think technologically, am I correct in thinking that to some degree, electricity production is now the low-hanging fruit, sort of the really challenging areas when it comes to climate change are things such as food production, cement production, steel production? Are these the areas that we need to sort of start focusing on, as political journalists or as the climate movement?
Yes, I think electricity production now, renewable energy. I mean, Bill McKibben puts it really beautifully. He says that right now, holding a piece of glass towards the sun is the cheapest form of making electricity on Earth. So I think we should all be grabbing that opportunity with both hands, whether it's India, whether it's China, whether it's any other country in the world. And that's easy. It's a low-hanging fruit. There is no reason why world's government shouldn't be doing that. The tougher bits are going to be transport. I mean, if you look at the US, despite the fact that electric vehicles are doing really, really well, it's a country that's entirely dependent. It's built for cars, and there isn't really a massive movement towards leaving internal combustion engine behind. They're running on hybrids, but despite Elon Musk's popularity, it feels like electrification of vehicles is happening slowly there. I think heat in this country, in particular, insulation, and the fact how people heat their houses, and the fact that those bills need to come down really quickly, that needs to happen. And yes, food, agriculture, how we use our land, that is going to be the big questions as we move forward.
on cement and steel, that's to me is where we really need sort of brand new technology, because sort of creating cement, I think, even regardless of how you're powering it, sort of creates carbon dioxide in the process. Do we need some sort of real radical innovations there?
There is green hydrogen there. So there is way of producing steel that actually deploys green hydrogen. And in fact, in this country, there was a missed opportunity when we shut down steel power plants. That was an opportunity to keep jobs here, because don't forget, alongside with changing of this technology, there's a massive opportunity to create jobs as well. And Port Talbot is one of those examples where we could have actually invested in green hydrogen and kept those jobs here. So that technology exists. It needs a little bit more investment and promotion from the government.
This one really is a story that brings together a number of my interests. In the FT today, they report that Tokyo is planning a 4-day working week to boost births. The 4-day week will be offered to all employees of Tokyo's metropolitan government, so public sector workers really, in a bid to stem the country's population decline. The city governor pledged this. We will continue to review our work style in a flexible manner so that nobody has to sacrifice their careers due to life events such as giving birth and caring for children. She also said the goal of empowering women was a long-standing challenge for the country, and she said Japan had lagged far behind the rest of the world. On that issue, of course. That could be one of the reasons for consistently low birth rates in Japan. Japan's birth rate fell below Britain's in the 1980s and has remained lower than ours ever since. Women in Japan, on average, have 1.2 children in their lifetimes. And combined with Japan's reluctance to increase immigration, this has led to the country having the world's oldest population. So in 2024, 29.3% of Japan's population was over 65. And 1 in 10 people in Japan are already over 80. This rapidly aging population has been blamed for Japan's high debt levels and decades of stagnant growth. Helena, of course, I suppose Japan's aging population, we should say, one half of this is it's a really good news story in the sense that Japanese people live long, healthy lives. That's why lots of them are over 80. But the other part of the story is they're having fewer kids. That will cause lots of economic problems. The dependency ratios, that's the number of the population who are sort of relying on pensions or social services compared to those of working age, increasing, and they have had low growth. Do you think they should be working to boost births? And do you think a 4-day week could do the trick?
I absolutely do think they should be working towards more births. I think broadly, we are seeing across the rich countries, the more economically developed countries in this world, we are seeing broadly the birth rates have been declining. And it is very heavily correlated between rich versus poor countries. There's a professor called Gary Becker who talks about the quantity quality thesis, which is about how the way in which we choose whether or not we have children is first of all is about the quality of your and your children's life, and the quantity in so much as having as many children as you think that you want. Of course, the more quality that you get out of it, the more quantity you're likely to want to have as well. And so, of course, if you have more children when you're in a richer society, you need to be able to ensure that not only do you have quality of life for your own children, but you can also have quality of life for yourself. And as more and more people are going to work in richer countries, and especially women are going to work, they don't have as much time to be able to provide quality time with their children as they used to be able to in poorer countries, who also rely on their children for things like helping out around the house and, of course, being caring for them when they're older. And alternative as well, depending on the economic model, being part of the income scheme for that household too. So we have broadly seen this trend move between rich and poor countries. But you also want to have a look at the differences between the richer countries as well, because it's not entirely fixated on the level of wealth the country has, because some richer countries within that group have higher birth rates than some of the poorer ones do within that specific cohort. So you've actually got to look at the individual policies and the individual societies and see why amongst richer countries some have higher birth rates and some have lower birth rates. And there are kind of 3 main areas for this. The first one, of course, a big one, is social policy. So for example, there is a very strong correlation between countries with widely available and affordable childcare and increased birth rates the ones that don't have that. So if you don't have a strong social policy that incentivizes your country, incentivizes the people in your country to be able to care for their children, whilst of course a lot more work is being done because both parents are going out to work, if you can have childcare, that increases birth rates a lot. The second thing is social norms. There's another big correlation that's interesting within this cohort of richer countries, and it's that countries where men take a more active role in raising children, they also have higher birth rates as well. So if you look at the difference where the higher birth rate countries like France, like the United States, France, Sweden, and Finland, I believe, and Norway, men have a much more active role in childcare in those countries, whereas you compare it to the bottom of that scale with even lower birth rates, Hungary, Poland, and Japan and South Korea, men don't have as active a role. And so there is very little ability for women to be able to know that they have the time to have children when they're also working at the same time. So social norms can dictate this too. The big third one, though, and this is where this particular policy I think is really interesting, is that the way in which countries shape their labor markets, that also has a really big impact on birth rates. So countries that have, for example, a lot of poorer workforces where the people on the bottom end of the income scale have less money to spend, they're less likely to have children. But there are also plenty of countries where there is an incentive to be more educated and to spend lots of your time advancing your career, whether or not you're a woman or a man, but especially amongst women. If you're trying to advance your career, you're going to put off having children as much as you can. So a policy like we'll have a 4-day work week, give people more time to be able to spend raising their children, along with like a change in social norms so that men who also have these 4-day work weeks spend more time with their children. This seems to me like a really interesting way of being able to incentivize people to be able to have more children. Now, do I think that childcare spending probably be a better way of doing this? I think so. But if you have an incredibly aging population, you're already spending loads of money on social security for old people already in elderly care. So how much extra money they've got to spend on childcare, I don't know. But I think given the state of Japan's labour market and the kind of work-life balance problems that they have, this is a really good policy to try and help one of the very myriad reasons why a country might have a low birth rate.
The idea of giving people extra days off, I think one of the big problems I think with society at the moment is that we don't allow ourselves to get bored enough, right? So people are quite busy when they're sort of in work. And then if you're not in work, anytime you have 5 seconds free to sort of where you might have a thought, you might look around and talk to someone, you look immediately at your phone. So actually, I would say that this is only going to work if people also stop. If people have 3-day weekends and they just spend their 3-day weekends looking at their phone, I'm not sure how effective this is going to be. I'll come back to you in one moment, Helena. I want to talk about another tactic or another strategy that Tokyo have that I think is actually quite smart. The Financial Times have sort of given it a slightly different framing. So they say Tokyo's efforts to address low births have become increasingly desperate. The Metropolitan Government this year launched a dating app in the hopes that its official association with the software and strict rules on membership would alleviate concerns and attract users serious about forming marriages and families. Along with personal and educational details, the app requires users to promise that they are using it with the goal of marriage rather than for short-term relationships. Governor Koike is among many politicians who see Japan's low marriage rate as a direct hindrance to more births. Now, Helena, I say the FT have sort of framed this as being desperate. I think this is a great idea because obviously dating apps, serve a useful purpose. I've used them in the past many times. But the financial model, obviously, for someone who is putting forward a private app is that they want you to use this as much as possible for as long as possible. So they want you to be constantly swiping. They want you to constantly be thinking, oh, do I like that guy or do I like that person better? Is this person going to reply to me? Shall I swipe a bit more while I'm waiting? It is that the financial model is to keep you on there. And obviously, the longer you're on there, you're not in a long-term relationship. So the idea that sort of the government say, we're going to intervene here. This app that they're making presumably isn't going to make any money if you're just trying to, get people to meet and then delete the app. This seems smart to me. What do you think?
I 100% agree. I 100% agree that allowing the profit motive to dictate how we engage in our social relations, that's a recipe for not particularly great societal outcomes. I think taking the profit motive out of it and letting the state do dating apps. I mean, it's difficult for me as a socialist to not get behind state ownership of something. But I think there's a really great video by a channel called YouGopnik talking about the many ways in which capitalism and markets and the profit motive has ruined dating as a concept. Constant competition, constantly trying to one-up each other, expecting perfection, treating dating like a market rather than treating it as something which we engage in holistically. Now, maybe having a dating app at all makes it to be treated like a market. So maybe we should be trying to move away from dating apps altogether. I don't know. I seem to have good success. Plenty of other people haven't had good experiences with dating apps. So maybe it's personal preference. But what you said there about the apps having a financial incentive to not actually to get you a relationship, as soon as you get into a long-term relationship, you delete the app and they can't target adverts at you anymore. That's not good for their business model. So removing that particular incentive structure and doing it not for profit, I can't see why you wouldn't do it. Yeah, that's probably the best way to put it. Like, it seems like you might as well have a go.
Have you seen Brooklyn, the movie?
I've not, no.
It's really good. I really recommend it. It's based on the book by Colm Tóibín. It's set in New York, sort of about Irish emigration to New York in the 1920s. But they just have a scene where she meets someone at a dance. And I feel like we should maybe bring back the dance, where the dance is sort of like everyone goes, they don't know each other, they sit with a couple of their friends who they've gone with, but then the norm is that you go up to someone and you say, would you like to dance? And then they dance for 5 minutes, and if they get on, maybe they fall in love for the rest of their lives, and if they don't, they move on. I think maybe bring back the dance. If you've got contacts in Tokyo city government and they want some advice, I've been watching all sorts of movies, and I've got all sorts of ideas. Before we finish this segment, I mean, movies like Hollywood movies. I actually think the other kind of movies are maybe also causing massive problems in this domain. I'm getting very old, aren't I, in this jumper? Before we finish this segment, it would be remiss to not point out a prominent figure in the news this week who also took an interest in Japanese birth rates. Well, this was a few months ago. He took the interest, but we've only discovered it this week for obvious reasons. Can you guess who I'm talking about? Lots of people seem to want his babies. It's none other than suspected CEO killer Luigi Mangione. Really interesting tweet from him. Modern Japanese urban environment is an evolutionary mismatch for the human animal. The solution to falling birth rates isn't immigration, it's cultural. And then he says, obviously lots of people watching this will disagree with that bit there, but let's move on to what he said afterwards. Encourage natural human interaction, sex, physical fitness, and spirituality. Ban Tenga fleshlights and Japan real hole custom porn star pocket pussies being sold in Don Quixote grocery stores. Replace conveyor belt sushi and restaurant vending machine ordering with actual human interaction with a waiter. Replace 24/7 esports cafes where young males earn false fitness signals via Tekken fighting and Overwatch shooting games with athletics in school. Heavily stigmatized maid cafes where lonely salarymen pay young girls to dress as anime characters and perform anime dances for them, and revitalize traditional Japanese culture, Shintoism, Okinawan karate, onsen, etc. Now, I'm not sure if these would be seen as sort of stereotypes about Japanese culture. I've never been to Japan. But this is an interesting sort of set of suggestions from a guy who the world is very interested in right now. What do you make of this tweet, Helena?
Broadly, there are a lot of things that we have turned into commodities that probably never should have been commodities. And whilst as a kind of libertarian type personally, in terms of the way we approach these things, I think there are plenty of reasons as to why we should be letting people be open with a lot of ways in which they kind of, all this kind of the sex positive stuff that kind of railed against in that tweet. I understand why he thinks that it's bad for engendering normal human interaction, right? And it's all about a level of moderation, I think, but outright bans on these things, something I'm usually going to be against.
Yeah, I think banning is going a bit too far there. He can't be right about everything. Not to endorse anything he's done ever in his life. Genuinely. I don't like political violence, you guys who watch this regularly. I feel very strongly about that. Let's go on to our next story. I'm being serious. Stop laughing. Whether it's artificial intelligence outsmarting us, climate change, tipping points, or nuclear war, there's no shortage of existential threats for humanity to worry about. But I'm afraid to inform you, today we have one more. A headline in the Mirror today reads, "Mirror bacteria made in labs poses unprecedented risk to all life on Earth. The story, which has been picked up across the papers today, is based on a discussion document published in the prestigious journal Science. The paper is called Confronting the Risks of Mirror Life. It's co-authored by many leading scientists, including 2 Nobel laureates. The paper is quite complicated. I can't pretend I've read it all, so I'm going to cheat and go back to the write-up in the Mirror. So they say about it this: molecules such as DNA or amino acids are described by scientists as being structured like human hands. The left and right hands look similar, but are crucially different. This handedness is what allows molecules to perform specific biological functions. But it also means it is possible to build mirror versions of organisms by ditching the right-handed DNA of life on Earth, using left-handed DNA instead. They say the capability to make mirror bacteria in a lab remains at least a decade away, but a group of scientists are already warning of the disasters that could come if research into mirror life continues unchecked. They outlined their concerns in an article published in Science. As mirror bacteria do not exist in human nature, humans and other animals would likely have no immunity to them. If laboratory containment were to fail, the scientists concluded infections could be severe. And they say a synthesized mirror microbe wouldn't just be essentially invisible to animals and likely plants, but also other microbes, including viruses that could attack and kill it. That was said by Vaughan Cooper, a microbiologist from the University of Pittsburgh. This form of life has never existed or evolved. Consequently, all biological interactions would be different or likely wouldn't work. So I found this quite confusing. It's the idea that sort of bacteria that naturally occur are right-handed, and these scientists think it will be possible, or some scientists already have created sort of left-handed bacteria, and that could be dangerous because if you make left-handed bacteria, our bodies won't be able to recognize it. And obviously, if you've got some kind of bacteria that we can't recognize or deal with, you can see why that might be dangerous. As I say, this is new to me. I thought it was somewhat complicated, but early today I messaged a friend, science journalist Stephen Brownie. He told me actually it's really quite simple. So I asked him to explain how we should understand mirror life.
I think it's actually pretty straightforward. So all molecules sort of arrange themselves in space. And so if you have a biological molecule, you can have one that is made of the same stuff, but is oriented a little differently. And the example that they use to teach this to undergraduates is basically that you've got 2 hands. They both contain 5 fingers. They are, in fact, mirror images of each other. But despite that, you can't put them over each other. And so each hand can do what the other hand can do. I can type with my right. I can type with my left. I can grip things with both. But if I were to go to, say, like a hand scanner, like you'd see in like a spy movie, I can't place my left hand in a right-handed hand scanner. So there are sort of differences between the two.
So the danger here, as far as I understand it, so because all life, I suppose, or all molecules, all DNA, is that what we're talking about here? Because all of them are, let's say for sake of argument, right-handed instead of left-handed, we can only read the right-handed molecules. They've worked out how to make left-handed ones, and we can't read those. Our sort of natural biological bodies don't know how to read them. And therefore, if they were to create some kind of left-handed bacteria, it could kill us all.
Yeah, that's right. So for stuff like your immune system, the way that the molecule is oriented in space has a lot to do with whether you recognize it. And the metaphor of the hand scanner works really well. It's like if a right-handed bacteria walks into your body, your immune system is like, hey man, put the hand on the scanner. And so it does. And it's like, hold up, wait a minute, you fit onto a bacteria, I'm going to kill you. But then if a left-handed bacteria walks in, your body will be like, hey man, let's check out who you are. And the hand won't fit on the scanner. And so it won't set off the alarms that the right-handed bacteria would. And so theoretically, it could just like march straight into your body.
If TB is a bacteria which, as it naturally occurs, is right-handed, our bodies know how to react to that and how to fight it off, either because we've got the vaccine or because we've been in contact with it at some point in time. If a left-handed TB bacteria were to come in my vicinity, I wouldn't know how to fight it off, and maybe it would kill me.
The first part, yeah, but the second part, it breaks down a little bit because there's a bit of a balance, right? Because your body knows how to recognize the right-handed TB. But on the other hand, the TB has spent, countless millennia evolving ways to work with your body to hide and to also hijack it. And so the left-handed TB might not get stopped by the guards, but at the same time, it might not be able to do very much inside your body. So the danger is really obvious, but I think the extended harm is a little less clear, and it would really have to be proven that these sort of all left-handed molecule bacteria or viruses or whatever they are would actually do anything. Because at the same time, right, like you encounter tons and tons of viruses and bacteria in the water, in the air, that don't pay you any mind because they infect other organisms. And those ones just either, most of them just kind of pass through, and because they don't go in and hijack anything, they're of no harm. So, there's a bit of a trade-off there.
Okay, that's interesting. So we wouldn't be able to recognize it, we wouldn't be able to fight it off, but maybe the nature of it wouldn't be able to do us any harm anyway. If the latter's the case, why have we got all of these leading scientists, including Nobel laureates, sort of saying this could be really bad? And I mean, headlines going as far as to say this could be an unprecedented risk to all life on Earth.
I think there's a couple things going on here. I mean, just at a very basic level, this research is like really preliminary, so it's a good time to intervene. The reason you would do this kind of research is because it's possible that by creating molecules that are oriented differently in space, but are still made in ways that we know how to sort of produce, they could have different effects. So like you could create a drug that we know the precursors for, we know how to create it, but because it's oriented in space a little bit differently, it actually acts a bit differently, or maybe your body doesn't break it down as fast if it's like a beneficial drug. So that could be a good thing. But I think these are scientists who have sort of weighed up the pros and cons and seen why you might want to go for this, but realized the negatives. And at this very early stage, it's quite easy to intervene and say, because it requires so much work to get to the point that these things would work, we could just halt it right here.
On one level, you could maybe see this as reassuring, right? You're saying this is not yet a direct threat to us, but you've got all of these leading scientists coming forward and saying, even though this is fairly far off, now is the time to sound the alarm so that we can do this all safely. Now, I suppose for someone like myself, who's not particularly adept when it comes to the details of stories such as this, and I think more about sort of the policy, the politics of it all, I've got these sort of warning lights flashing. This is all reminding me of the COVID lab leak hypothesis. I know it's still somewhat up in the air what actually happened, but everyone seems to agree it's at least plausible. Not everyone, but lots of people agree it's at least plausible that COVID-19 was a virus that had been manipulated in a lab and then released by accident, I should say, not a sort of bioweapon, but by accident. Could we see a similar thing happening now?
I think that's what they're trying to get ahead of. I mean, I think there's a couple ways to read between the lines. I mean, you mentioned sort of how eminent a lot of these scientists are. I think a really telling thing is that George Church of Harvard, who is a bit of a provocateur as a synthetic biologist, when Hu Jingqi, the Chinese scientist, edited baby embryos, he was kind of like, what's the big deal? So if he's coming out and saying this is a bad idea, I think you can sort of read between the lines there and say that he's actually a bit perturbed by it. But again, I think it's a place where they're looking and they're not seeing the benefits outweighing the risk. And it is a place where, unlike some of the viral research where there's a lot of danger, even if you're not manipulating viruses, but we have always just sort of said that danger is acceptable because, the outputs of viral research in terms of vaccines and things are just so positive. They're looking at one where the trade-off's just maybe not so great.
When I listen to podcasts about existential risk or whatever, what they're often talking about is sort of advances in biology allowing us to create quite dangerous synthetic things. And also sort of how cheap technology is becoming alongside AI, meaning that maybe this, the barriers to entry of getting involved in this stuff could not actually be that high. So what do you see? I suppose it's related to mirror life, but also sort of synthetic viruses or whatever. How worried should we be about sort of the cost of doing bioengineering radically falling? And even if you've got all these well-meaning scientists saying, we should regulate this, we should be careful, you have some renegades going it alone and accidentally or purposefully releasing some kind of bacteria or virus which could seriously harm us all.
I mean, it's an interesting question because, again, I'm not quite sure how to read it. I mean, I think there's one reading where, as I said before, these eminent biologists have really identified a place you could intervene now to stop that from happening. And I think the intervening now is like, you're talking about barriers coming down, but like this stuff is really, really hard now. And like they say a decade away, I would guess more, and like many decades before it would be very easy for like you to buy an off-the-shelf kit from a biotech company to do it. So maybe they're just worried about that. But the AI comparison is really interesting because there's another way you can read this as sort of biologists acting a bit like AI researchers and just being in an age of existential threat, and sort of overcooking this a little bit in terms of the media presentation. They're pretty doomery about it, and it does just remind me a bit of the sort of people who say, "Oh, in 10 years, we're going to have general intelligence that might exterminate us all." When I'm not sure if that pathway is really as likely as they think it is.
Moving away from Mirror Life for one moment, I know we got you on the show about 3 years ago to talk about the lab leak hypothesis. Where are we on that? I know I said sort of, as far as I understand, it's still up in the air. Are we any closer? And I suppose, synthetic or gain of function viruses, that is a technology that's here. Has there been sort of a move to regulate that more effectively than maybe was the case once?
There's not a huge amount of overall regulation. There have been some sort of attempts to create these sort of transnational bodies. I think sort of the scary thing about it is that a lot of this stuff just proceeds as national bodies will allow it or not. I will say with most synthetic biology stuff, for instance, He Jiankui, the person who edited human embryos, and the Chinese state came down on him like a ton of bricks, and the sort of scientific backlash was pretty huge. So I think the system as it exists functions pretty well. I mean, I think this report, which is quite extensive, I only got through about half of it today, is sort of a reflection of that. You've got these very powerful scientists appealing to national governments and regulatory bodies to sort of tamp this stuff down. So I think that's the positive aspect. But I think the negative aspect is that it's going to go country by country in terms of what's allowed, and will sort of go with the consensus of the scientific establishment. So there is, to answer the question shortly, there is no big steps taken to sort of ban this sort of thing worldwide. Although, of course, science is heavily collaborative. So if you're going to go it alone for something like this, which is very, very difficult, very, very preliminary, it's just going to be very, very hard to get the kind of expertise together transnationally, internationally, to get anything like this done.
The unexpected fall of Bashar al-Assad has prompted a very public reappraisal of Britain's approach to the Middle East. In particular, Ed Miliband's decision to vote against Western intervention against Assad in 2013 has been criticised, including by Piers Morgan, speaking here on Question Time.
He could have gone in 2013 if Labour had got their act together and not voted against military action that David Cameron, the Prime Minister, wanted to take. And by Labour voting that down under Ed Miliband's leadership, Barack Obama then bottled it. And out of that came Russia siding with Assad. And out of that came all the mayhem, not just in loss of life and appalling scenes in Syria, but the enormous numbers of people who then left Syria and migrated across Europe, causing all sorts of problems in all sorts of countries, not least for the poor people that were being displaced. So it was carnage which we could have stopped as a country, I think, back in 2013. And Ed Miliband's been very quiet about what he did back then.
So he's speaking, of course, of an enormous amount of confidence there. There was carnage that we could have stopped. Now, of course, we have a lot of examples where the West did try and stop what was going on. I suppose Libya being the obvious example here. Iraq has nothing to do with this because Iraq, we made up a bunch of reasons and then went and invaded a relatively stable country. The debate in Libya and Syria were quite similar because there was a civil war and a oppressive leader. And then the debate was whether or not we should take out that oppressive leader. Now, we did it in Libya. What happened? State collapse and civil war. Ed Miliband in 2013, I think quite reasonably, thought, well, do we really want to do this again and create state collapse and, well, I suppose the civil war was already going on, wasn't it? But create state collapse and whatever could happen after that. Wes Streeting was on the panel with Piers Morgan and was asked if he agreed with Piers Morgan.
With hindsight, I think we can say, looking back on the events of 2013, that the hesitation of this country and the United States create a vacuum that Russia moved into and kept Assad in power for much longer.
So that was a mistake by Labour.
Hang on just a second. What I cannot say with certainty, and what we can't say for certainty even now, that the rat has fled to Moscow, to his backers, we cannot say that the back of Assad is going to lead to a better Syria yet. We don't know. It's too soon to judge. There are some encouraging signs, which range from the fact that the new regime is working with the international community to hand over chemical weapons stockpiles, right through to the utterly appalling fact that there are children who've walked out into freedom, who were born into prison, have never seen the sun, never seen the sky, never seen a tree, and that is the kind of regime they were living under. So do I think that back in 2013, had we acted, Russia would have been there and Assad would have been propped up for as long as he had? I don't think that's true. I think if the West had acted faster, Assad would have been gone. Would that have led to a better Syria than the one we've had under Assad?
Else in.
I don't know.
I've only got 3 minutes left.
We know from our own foreign policy history, inaction is a choice, but so is action. And we've seen in other cases like Libya, where action did not lead to a better future.
This has been written up all day. So I sort of read about this story before I watched the clip. And everyone's written this up as sort of Wes Streeting lays into Ed Miliband. And I was sort of expecting to see something really, sort of very sort of Blairite in it, sort of, yes, we should have intervened in the Middle East and that would have brought about peace and democracy. In fact, after seeing the clip, it seemed more reserved than I was expecting. I mean, because basically I don't share Wes Streeting's politics at all, but what he said is that, if the West had intervened, Assad would have fallen sooner and Russia wouldn't have entered, which is quite true, really. I mean, it's uncontroversially true. The controversial part is, would it have got better or would it have got even worse? And he was admitting there that we don't know. So I didn't think he was sort of laying into Ed Miliband as much as other people have made out. Ed Miliband, of course, is able to speak for himself. When he was asked about his decision in 2013 on Good Morning Britain on Friday morning.
You, when you were the leader of the opposition back in 2013, voted against and called for votes against military action against Syria back then. Knowing what we know now, do you regret that decision?
No, I don't. Assad was a brutal dictator, and it's horrific what he was doing. We knew at the time he was a brutal dictator. The question I had on the table at the time was, do we bomb him? Now, I believe that after the war in Iraq, where hundreds of British troops died and thousands were injured, we should not commit British troops to combat unless we had a clear plan. What would it involve for Britain? What was our exit strategy and how would we achieve our war aims? And I didn't believe the proposition David Cameron put on the table met that criteria. As for whether Assad would have fallen earlier, we know that Donald Trump, when he was president in the US in 2017 and 2018, also did take action to bomb Assad, which didn't happen in 2013, and Assad didn't fall. So I neither believed it was right for Britain, nor do I actually believe it would have hastened the end of Assad.
Helena, this is all being sort of reported, as I say, as sort of a big bust-up between two cabinet members. I think it might be a bit overblown.
I agree. I think it's overblown. I watched the Question Time live on stream, and I didn't think that we were getting, massively pro-interventionist politics there from Wes Streeting at all. I thought it was answered, despite like how you don't have any ideological sympathies with Wes Streeting, neither do I. And I think he seemed pretty reasonable. What I would disagree with, though, is trying to say that it's nothing to do with things like Iraq, whereas, of course, the reasons for invading Iraq were complete nonsense in the same way that the chemical weapons threats from Assad were very real. The way in which that Saddam treated his own citizens, I think that's reasonably comparable to the way Bashar al-Assad treated his own citizens. And I absolutely disagree with interventionism in Iraq, and I would have disagreed with interventionism in Syria too, especially galling coming from somebody like Piers Morgan, who continually bangs on about how the Daily Mirror, when I was the editor, we opposed the war in Iraq. Well, do you like interventionism or do you not like interventionism, Piers? Please make up your mind on this. And I think the point about Libya rings very, very true in terms of how we deposing pretty totalitarian, pretty awful regimes leaves power vacuums when we try and do it ourselves. I think at least the one thing that, despite my gigantic amount of skepticism over people like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and definitely my skepticism towards the SNA, at least what's happened now in Syria is we've allowed Syrians themselves to make the decisions of what happens with their own countries. Whereas, of course, if we just continue to impose upon countries in the Middle East what the West wants them to do, that's not a way to be able to be geopolitically popular or to engender new governments and new regimes and new structures of authority that have the popular support of the people in Syria. And also to say that Ed Miliband was being like a coward by not trying to greenlight this stuff in Parliament. He was doing the correct thing. There was not popular support for British interventionism in Syria in 2013. There absolutely was not. What Ed Miliband was doing was respecting the will of the constituents of every single Labour Party MP, and probably plenty of people in the Conservative and Liberal Democratic parties as well at the time, who did not support this action at all. That's how Parliament is supposed to work. You're supposed to represent the interests of your constituents. Whether that was the right choice or the wrong choice is by the by. The public didn't want it, and Parliament is supposed to represent the interests of the public. And I fully supported Ed Miliband at the time, and I still do today.
Let's look at one more sort of, potentially surprising intervention today, because the line of questioning being put to Ed Miliband that you saw on sort of Good Morning Britain and coming from Piers Morgan is that he wasn't interventionist enough when it came to Assad. Why in 2013 didn't you back David Cameron when he wanted to get Britain into another sort of military expedition in the Middle East? It seems, though, that charge might be out of step with the time. Right? These are very different moments to 10 or 20 years ago. And Robert Jenrick today had an interesting piece in The Telegraph. So Robert Jenrick, now the Shadow Justice Secretary. The headline, "Neoconservatism is dead. Good riddance." And he says a quarter century of failed foreign interventions have made the world a much more dangerous place. Now, this is the first headline I've ever seen where there's a sentence next to Robert Jenrick's face, and I agree. I don't agree with everything in the article, but it is interesting. He celebrates the fact that the West appears to be staying out of Syria, at least officially. And then he says this: "After thousands of lives lost and trillions of dollars wasted on foreign adventures, Western leaders might have finally realized good intentions do not ordain good outcomes. On Sunday, President Biden, the embodiment of extreme liberal foreign policy doctrine, limited his response to the Syria crisis to drone strikes on IS groups. When the history books are written, the fall of the Assad regime may well bookmark 2 sorry decades of expensive wars in peripheral countries that the West has emphatically lost, all while our main adversaries in Moscow and Beijing gathered strength. The consequences of these catastrophic failures have belatedly rebounded on the protagonists. During the recent presidential election, the Cheney family name proved toxic with voters for Dick's role masterminding the Iraq and Afghan wars. Trump's victory marks a complete rejection of the neoconservative clique that has dominated US foreign policy for years. The guilty men on this side of the Atlantic who prosecuted these disastrous wars continue to be rewarded by polite society." So, sorry, he's now moved on to sort of complaining that in the UK we haven't sort of dismissed the neocons in the same way that they did in America, or at least the liberal interventionists. He says Blair's chief of staff, Jonathan Powell, who helped orchestrate Britain's involvement in the Iraq war, despite Bush making very clear to Blair in 2002 that we needn't participate, has returned to Downing Street. And then he complains, Peter Mandelson, Blair's eminence Gree, is tipped for the plum role of ambassador to the United States. And the man who hoodwinked the public, Alistair Campbell, has been welcomed into the bosom of the liberal elite to lecture about disinformation and standards in public life. His role justifying the Iraq war airbrushed out like a Soviet history book. Helena, I suppose this is Robert Jenrick taking his lead from Donald Trump in a way. Donald Trump sort of saying, I am standing against the bipartisan establishment who were for expensive, pointless interventions abroad. I don't think we've heard that stated in such a strident fashion from a conservative in this country. Maybe you'd sort of hear this kind of thing from Nigel Farage, but sort of from someone who's in the shadow cabinet, in the Conservative Party, clearly one day wants to be the leader of the Conservative Party. Is this significant and is this welcome, I suppose?
I mean, I just had a shower before we started the show. Might have another one now just to wash kind of the stench of agreeing with Robert Jenrick off me. It feels weird. It feels very strange, but he's right. He's 100% right. Especially the bit where we we forget about all the things that Peter Mandelson and Alistair Campbell are responsible for, and they just appear on our TV screens. It never gets questioned. All of the liberal darlings tuning into the rest as politics. I'm like, hang on a minute, that's the dossier guy. What are you doing with the? Why are you paying attention to anything this man has to say? But regardless, I think that it is really him trying to tap into, and we saw this during the election campaign as well, him rebranding from this one nation Tory image that he had up until 2021 or so, rebranding himself into this kind of Pied Piper of Trumpian politics in the UK. It's clear specifically who he thinks he wants to appeal to, and where he thinks that the future of conservatism, especially in Western countries, is going to go. And I understand why he's doing it. I think it's a grift. Like, I don't think he's doing a lot of these things in total amount of earnest, but it's clear that this is where the direction of travel is going with right-wing politics across, especially the Anglosphere, especially in the United Kingdom and in the US, where the idea of foreign policy is totally, we don't want to spend any money. Don't want to spend any money, any time doing anything anywhere else. We're just going to sit and do America first. We're going to do Britain first, and anything else outside of that, we shouldn't be engaging in. And I have a disagreement with that kind of politics broadly, in that whilst I am firmly anti-interventionist, I do think that we should be at least assisting people who we're allies with. So, for example, if you look at Syria right now, the one thing that was stopping the Turkish-backed militias from advancing into Rojava was the presence of American troops within northeastern Syria. And as soon as they withdrew, there was a big strip of land that got taken by Turkish-backed militants in that area. And I think this is bad. We are allied with these people. And I think, Western governments having troops on the ground in Rojava to be able to protect them from all of the potential fallout of what's happening in Syria right now, I think that would be a good thing. I don't think we need to completely isolate ourselves, as long as we're not doing regime changing, intervening where we aren't wanted. But broadly, I think that Robert Jenrick is right, both in the fact that neoconservatism is dead, because it is dead, both in the UK and in the United States, especially in the United States. And I also agree with him that it's good that it's gone as well, and that this aggressive interventionist policy from Western governments to impose freedom on people, that the meme, essentially the Team America World Police meme, I think he's right with that. I'm just going to have to go and wash very, very, very thoroughly to be able to say those phrases on stream.
Someone pointing out in the comments, which I think is correct, which is that sort of to suggest the West haven't really got involved in Syria this time around would be overlooking the fact that Israel, which is armed to the teeth by the West, has decided to take this opportunity to occupy vast swathes of Syria and destroy their naval fleet and every kind of military sort of capacity that the state has. So that is very much true. I think if Robert Jenrick would be a braver man if he also said in his article that maybe Israel should stop destroying the army before we know who's going to take over. But obviously this is the same man who sort of goes jogging with jumpers that say, what did his jumper say? Was it F Hamas or something like that?
Well, he went to, it was the Conservative conference. He was doing a whole speech wearing a Hamas are terrorists hoodie on. Yeah, and I fully agree with the commenters. Yeah, I mean, if we want to truly be anti-interventionist, it's not good enough to just make ourselves not do things. We have to be ensuring the people who are part of our geopolitical sphere are also not doing things, rather than just giving a carte blanche to essentially use Israel as a proxy, right? Like, I agree with that.
We'll wrap up. I have to say, I've really enjoyed the live comments today. Lots of people sort of saying they'd quite like to go to a dance to meet their partner. Other people who seem to be getting wrecked watching the show. All very charming. Everyone getting into the festive spirit, it seems. Helena, thank you so much for joining me this evening. It's been a pleasure to be joined by you twice this week.
Absolutely. And I've been enjoying the comments as well. Thank you very much, everybody, for your kind words. And I'll see you next.
Oh, we cut you out a little bit early there, but there we go. Gary's still getting used to this. Thank you, everyone, for watching tonight. You're watching Novara Live. Have a fantastic weekend. We'll see you on Monday at 6 p.m.